Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, obviously, you're talking about a space with content and podcasting that's like, as you said, it's you're inferring that it's extremely crowded, and the only way to really stand out is to do these like non-obvious things in terms of positioning and marketing to like really be more distinct. How did that hit you? Because I've been thinking about this honestly a lot myself. I just did my this podcast is pretty new. This show is pretty new. It's 1 year old, just hit the 1 year anniversary a couple weeks ago. I think we have like 80 episodes. And I
Mhm.
went out to my audience and basically asked them that. I'm like, is this what you want? Is this, do you want me to go more this
Yeah.
direction or that direction? Or do you want more focus or less focus? And it was really interesting actually, because sometimes when you do these things, it's honestly just a thought exercise for yourself to talk it out loud in order to like see it up on in front of you visually in the wall in
Mhm.
words, and then go, okay, which one do I actually want? So how did that come about for you? Because your show's awesome, and I've caught many of the episodes myself, so I'm curious how you got to that point.
Yeah, thank you. Well, it started kind of with this concept that I wanted to do something that could exist with a tagline that said not just another interview show. Because I had so many friends of mine who were authors, and we all do the same thing. As soon as our book comes out, we go on all the podcasts and we
Yes,
talk
sir.
about our
Yep.
book.
Yeah.
And we do. I mean, I'm lucky. I get to do high caliber podcasts, and so people ask great questions. So it's not like I'm answering the same question every time, but I am kind of talking about the same thing, which is my book.
Mm.
And I just started thinking, well, I want to, first of all, I want to interview people about something other than that. But second of all, I want to have guests who don't just have a book that just came out. I want to talk to them about some
Right.
fascinating, amazing things that they're doing. Like I did a show where I brought on a bunch of people who'd worked with NASA, and they would talked about the land rover and the moon land. I mean, the Mars landing. And that was just a fascinating show, but there was no book attached to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I wanted to be able to do that. And so the concept came about because every week I spend so much time coming up with the most interesting and non-obvious stories of the week. And I thought, well,
Mm-hmm.
can I take those and blend them with this conversation so that if I have somebody who is like an emotional intelligence expert, instead of talking to them about their book, I can talk to them about Naomi Osaka withdrawing from the French Open and
Mm.
what that meant for how we should think about emotional intelligence. So like there was this context of like the world that I could bring into it. And if I could do that in a way that would just spotlight really fascinating stories and ask them things they'd never been asked before, that just felt more interesting to me.
And that's the most important part. I think that's a great pivot. And ultimately, as you said, it felt more interesting to you. And it's so funny you bring this up and you're talking about this, because I think about this stuff all the time. I mean, so for example, when it comes to branding, when it comes to marketing, when it comes to strategy, you're a true expert. You've been doing this for a long time. You decided you're in the world of thought leadership, and the brand that you have is, you're Mr. Non-Obvious, right? It's
Right.
so catchy, it's so unique, it stands out. It's a very clear sort of like positioning in the marketplace, and it's memorable. Another important factor, I think. So,
Yeah.
do you ever worry about how you position yourself, and whether in 5 years or 1 year or 20 years you feel overly siloed? How do you manage that? How do you think through that process for yourself? But even if you were like consulting an individual thought leader or a company, because I know companies go through this. I go through it with the flow thing as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting time for me because what you're seeing now with me being the non-obvious guy is me, that's my answer to that. So
Mm-hmm.
that's actually
Mm-hmm.
not the problem because I've had that problem before. Like this is not my first book. Like my first book was called Personality Not Included. And when that came out, my whole topic was that brands need to have a personality. And that was my big message. And I became the personality branding guy. And that was a pigeonhole. And then my next book was all about
Yeah.
why we do business with people that we like. And I became the likability guy. And that was my pigeonhole. And so, like, I'm graduating from that to something that I feel like is much broader because now it's no longer about like this one thing in branding or like this one thing in sales. It's like
Yes.
be non obvious. Like, that to me is a much bigger idea. Like, I can do so many more things with that. And so, what you're seeing now is the result of me having evolved out of the pigeonholes I was in.
Yeah. I was in my own. So believe me, I feel you, man. And It's an evolution then, and there isn't necessarily a perfect answer. I mean, everybody's gone through it. Some of the greatest authors of all time, Tim Ferriss was Mr. 4 Hour, and it's a blessing and a curse, right? It's
I,
like he did three of them, and then he's like, "Fuck it, I'm tired of this. I got to get away from this because I can't do another 4 hour." I mean, I'm speaking for him. I shouldn't do that, but it was something along the lines of that from what I read on his blog, and so it's like, okay, that makes sense. But it's interesting because it is what elevates you. It is what puts you into the conversation to have good branding, to put yourself out there, have really good positioning, and have some sort of label. So it's very beneficial. And that's why I see it as kind of, it can become a pigeonhole and a curse. And so do you think it's just ultimately a matter of reevaluating from time to time and doing what's true to you or to your audience? Like, how do you stop and process that? Or what, let's go back to, the non-obvious. Like, how did you know to stop and kind of do that? Did it start to feel confining, literally, like the brand itself was confining?
yeah, I think especially when you start to have, I mean, I've always had multiple brands because I've had a book, which becomes a brand on its own. And
Mm-hmm.
then I've had me as my personal brand, which is just my name. And then when you think about being a professional speaker, like that's what people are looking at. Like, oh, I've heard of this guy because I've heard of his name, not because I heard of his book.
Right.
And so I'm building a brand for me. And so the tension for me was always like this company brand versus individual brand. And like, it's great for me to build up non-obvious, but if people don't know my name, then I'm not going to get the speaking gigs that are meant to kind of come with that drive a lot of the business and a lot of the other things. And
Mm.
so there is always that tension. And I think where I've managed to square it away is I found a brand for myself with non-obvious that I feel is big enough where I don't feel uncomfortable
Mm-hmm.
sitting behind it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm happy to be the non-obvious guy. Whereas before, if you said to me, you're the economics guy, that felt one dimensional. It just didn't feel right.
Got it. Wow. If you were kind of starting out today, or if you were advising someone who's starting out today, it's like we have new words for this, but it used to be, author, entrepreneur. I think of like, say, like the Brendan Bouchard model. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but it's like
Sure.
he was kind of he's OG sort of in this world, and then it kind of evolved to this idea of thought leadership. It makes me think of people like Simon Sinek and others like that. And now we're living in this world of influencers. At the end of the day, they're all the same thing. It is someone who is building a brand for themselves through some form of thought leadership and ideally supports that with books or services or products or software or merch now, whatever that might be.
Mhm.
So, if you were going about this world today, how would you recommend someone sit down and think about how to position themselves in a way that actually is sort of a unique blue ocean in the marketplace in a world of like incessant number of new people trying to do the same thing every day. Like everybody wants to be a YouTuber and influencer now.
Yeah. And I think that one of the things that I myself have struggled with is the tension between trying to get good at something that's not natural for me versus doubling down on something that I already know I'm good at.
Hmm.
And I know I'm a good writer. I mean, I have a master's degree in English. I've always been a writer, you know.
Hmm.
Even before I wrote books, I was writing. And I've not ever been a video personality, like a YouTube personality, or like
You're pretty
somebody who's
damn good at it, man.
well, thank you. But I figured it out,
But
right?
yeah,
To some
yeah,
degree. But still, when you think about like the videos that I produce and compare them to like people who are really great at them, yeah,
yeah.
I'm never going to be better than
We're
they
not
are
gonna
at
be
doing it.
Logan Paul or Jake Paul. Let's face it.
I mean, I don't know that those guys are, that's a different style, right? That's a
I
different
know,
group.
I know. I'm playing around.
Yeah, but like you know what I mean? Like there's
Totally.
people who just have that sort of like I want to be the best in the world if I'm going to do
Hmm.
something like that. I don't want to be pretty good. And like
Hmm.
I could be a pretty good YouTuber, but it's not going to be the best in the world. Whereas like some of these things that I can produce through writing, like I could go out to my newsletter that I spent hours and hours every week putting together that promises to everyone who reads it that these are going to be the most interesting and non-obvious and underappreciated stories of the week. And I can say, that's one of the best newsletters in the world for that audience.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that. And that's what I'm going to invest a lot of my time and effort in to make. So to answer your question, like what would somebody do if they're just starting out? They may not know what they're going to be the best at, but they probably know what they kind of suck at. And I think that one of the challenges for us is like, don't try really hard to suck slightly less at the thing that you are really struggling with. Instead, try and get even better at the thing that you're already pretty good at, so that you can double down on that. And then, don't be a one-dimensional person, right? I mean, we want to build our skills and be able to do other things, but like figure out what you can do that you're actually passionate about, that you actually like doing, as opposed to something that feels like it's total work to have to put out this newsletter every week. And you're like, oh man, now I got to do this thing again. Like that's the worst. That feeling is just terrible, that you're doing it because you have to.
Yeah. That's no different than being in a job you hate. Except it's one you created for yourself. It's terrible. And I've been in that position actually. Early days. I mean, I've been in this game now, kind of independent, let's just call it, entrepreneur for 10 years. And back then, man, it was blogging. That was like where all the energy and focus went. And so you kind of follow those waves of market trends, which we can talk about trends. You kind of follow them, you jump into them, and you try to find the right positioning for yourself within that is your sweet spot in terms of what you do best. But it is a very complex thing. I know this because I talk about this constantly. You talk about this constantly. I know you know it really well as well. It's like, this is the number one thing I think people really struggle with when they're first starting to pick up that side hustle, become independent, do the art that is most honest to them, to become a creator in this creator economy. It's like, where do I start? Do I start a Shopify store? Do I write a book? Do I YouTube? And it's a big challenge. I think it's deep work is the way you're kind of describing it. It's like you got to really sit and be honest with yourself and not sell your soul. Is that kind of the beginning direction, at least? Is there an exercise a person could do? Is there a you're sitting down and forcing me, like, how would we make it happen?
Yeah, look, in my lingo, in my marketing lingo, I would call the essential task here positioning. And the idea of positioning is always to be thinking about, how do I become a bigger player in a smaller space? So how do I become someone that stands out and that's different, that's known for being different for a reason? And like, I was early to blogging as well. I started my blog in 2004. And in 2004, there really weren't that many bloggers. And so when Ad Age magazine publishes an article saying the 25 top marketing bloggers, they're pretty much listing all of us. That's it. Like, there wasn't really anyone else.
Yeah.
And so this idea of like being an OG, right, so to speak, might seem totally impossible right now, because like everybody's on every platform. But at the same time, there are new platforms launching all the time. And so I do think, and people like me who are entrenched on the platforms we're already on are like much more resistant, and I'll go off and start something new on something else. Because if I have 50,000 people following me somewhere, how much effort and time am I going to really spend building up a new audience somewhere else? So like I have a barrier to now going and jumping onto a new platform that somebody who isn't as widely known on a platform doesn't. You can jump onto these new things. And I think the benefit is that you get a chance to get in front of the people who really matter for you, in terms of knowing who you are, like knowing you exist. And that's a lesson that I've learned like over and over. Like when I was writing my first book, I knew that people had not really heard of me beyond kind of the small insular marketing blogging world. And so I needed somebody famous, relatively famous, to do a forward for the book. And I set my sights on Guy Kawasaki.
Trying to remember. It was Guy.
Yeah. But I didn't know him, and he didn't know me. And when I was doing my research, I found that there was a presentation contest that he had agreed to judge. And so I thought, well, if I enter this contest and I do decently, or I at least get onto the radar, maybe he will have seen something of mine, so that when I do reach out to him, he will like at least know who I am. And so I didn't win the presentation contest, but I got like some sort of placement, like something, like top 10 or whatever. And after that, I reached out to him, cold email, and I said, "Hey, I've got this book. I think you'll really like it. I've been inspired by everything you've written, and I would love to have you look at it." And he got back to me right away, and he said, "I don't really do that." And I said, "Okay, well, will you just take a look at it and no obligations, no nothing, take your time." So he's like, "All right, fine, just send it to me." So I sent him the kind of first chapter and the intro or whatever part of the book I did. A week later, he comes back to me and he says, "When do you need it by?" And I
Nice.
said, "As long as you tell me, like however long you need, we'll change the whole time schedule for you." And he ended up doing the forward. And for me, like what that taught me is that if I just randomly emailed him, maybe he would have responded, maybe he wouldn't have,
Yeah.
right? But at least I had some context so that I felt better about reaching out, that it wasn't like
Oh.
a cold email. And so it made me more confident when I reached out. And so probably the way I wrote that email was not quite as desperate as it might have otherwise been if
Yeah.
I didn't feel that.
Yeah, big time. I've had very little success with cold reach out. You get lucky here and there, but too many people rely on that as their default mode of
Yeah.
communication. And yeah, I get a lot of that kind of request, not that specific kind of request, but different types of requests as well. And there is oftentimes a desperation, as you said, in the tone. Or the worst thing somebody can do is vomit like 3 pages in an email. You're not.
Mhm.
That's like the way I tell people is that's actually disrespectful. Like you have to be emotionally intelligent enough to know that while this person might admire you right back and care about your story and have enough empathy to want to know everything that's happened in your life, it's like dating, man. Like slow down, know that, you start by, can I buy you a drink? You don't
Yeah.
go into, I got all this trauma. Let me
Yeah.
tell you
Yeah.
about my
Yeah. Totally.
life. And
Yep.
so we in this industry, I think sometimes are missing some of those like fundamentals, and where a person can be really successful is the way I hear what you're describing is creating context for yourself, creating comfort for yourself, where it does completely change the tone. I've had this interaction, whether this person knows it or not. So that's
Mhm.
awesome, man. And to think, it's funny, like, would you say that was a catalyst in your career? Like, just that happening, like, really sort of
Yeah, I
created
mean,
a
look,
lot of
there's
success with the
been
book?
so many of those moments, right? So like I'm very lucky because I can't even point to just one. I mean, getting the
Yeah.
book deal with McGraw-Hill was another one, right?
Mm-hmm.
Getting Deepak Chopra to do the cover blurb for my second book was like a big one too, right? Because now
Mm-hmm.
that legitimized the next thing. So there's been so many of those moments, and I think that what I've figured out from them is like there's a lot of this discussion right now around self-confidence, self-esteem, being able
Mm.
to feel like you belong in the room, and being able to give that to yourself instead of relying on someone else to give it to you is a huge skill that I think is very difficult to find
Mm.
the natural ability to do. But once you can do that, uh, imagine you can prop yourself up. And it's not because there's no
Yeah.
one to do it for you and you have a sad life and everyone else is pushing you down, and so you only have yourself. That's not what I'm saying, right?
Mm.
I have lots of people who can do that for me, and I am grateful for that. But to be able to do it for yourself is a skill set that I think when you can master that, you don't have to wait for someone to give you the validation to go and do the
That's
thing you
right.
want to do. Like you can do it yourself.
That's right. And you can shift that direction at any age. I honestly believe that. You can be a kid, a really young person,
Mm-hmm.
and develop that confidence. And you can do that late in life. I hear from people sometimes, and they're like, is it too late for me to do X or Y or believe X or Y? And that makes me really sad because you're alive. Like, you got days left, a day
Yeah.
left, whatever you got left. It's never too late. We don't know what we have left. I don't know what I have left, you know? And so it's
Yeah.
never, ever too late. And it's an inner game, is what I also hear. It's like, it's not something that you have to wait for somebody to give to you, but I guess that's where a lot of the personal development, psychology, self-awareness, emotional intelligence comes into play, and knowing yourself comes into play. Because that confidence, like, it doesn't only require. What do you think about the argument of fake it till you make it? Then, like, relate in somewhat in this context. Do you think that that's good advice, or do you think that's shitty advice?
I think it can be both, because I think that faking it till you make it, one interpretation of that to me is there's someone who says, "Hey, can you do this?" Or no, they ask you, "Have you done this?"
Right.
And you haven't, but you know how to do it, right? So like my first job that I got in Australia when I moved there and I had no job and I had no nothing, was I interviewed for a job where somebody said, "Hey, have you done front end web coding in HTML for a website?" And I knew how to code in HTML, but I'd never done that. But I said, "Yes, I've done that before," because I knew I could do it. So that's faking it. And then I made it and I got the job. So that's like an example where it works. But the other one is fake it till you make it, where you're just pretending to have knowledge and eventually you get called out because you overpromised or you pretended to know how to do something that you actually don't know. That is not a good way to go, because that impacts your reputation much worse when eventually you get found out, which always happens. Eventually people figure it out. And sometimes it may not be a public figuring out. It's just the people who are in the circle who have to compensate for your lack of knowledge, who know. But even that is like, I mean, those are your professional colleagues, and now they have to compensate because you pretended to know something that you don't. And that's your reputation.
I totally agree. I've watched it happen to many people. I totally agree. So, Rohit, speaking of trends, non-obvious megatrends right behind you. What's a trend right now? I was thinking about this morning. I was like, what is something I see? So what are some trends right now that you're personally excited about, or things that you're thinking about in any realm, like totally open, doesn't have to be in any one industry or facet of life?
Yeah, and I tend to think when I write about trends, I tend to think of them across the board. So across industries, intersections between them. I mean, that's a big part of my whole methodology and the way I think about it. One that's been on my mind a lot, both in a positive and a negative sense, is the idea of protective technology, protective tech, which I wrote about. And the reason why it's been on my mind is because on the one hand, you have things like Amazon announcing their whole sidewalk program, which basically takes your internet connection and shares it with your neighbors so that they can sort of, increase the distance of the network through your Ring doorbell. And like the potential for them to use that for just totally evil stuff is like off the charts. So like that's scary. But at the same time, like you've got this new technology with in-home care and like robots being able to care for elderly people, or like alert you when a routine is not followed so that you can take care of somebody before they actually seriously injure themselves, like if they have dementia or something like that. And like that stuff's amazing. Or like, weather tech or drones that make sure that nobody's poaching rhinos during the pandemic, or like, all of these things that protect our environment or animals, or like, so there's this huge upside of protective tech that helps us to live in a safer, more environmentally friendly world where animals don't go extinct as quickly. And on the flip side, there's like this tech that could turn into surveillance tech, and that could be with algorithmic bias, reading our facial features incorrectly if we have darker skin. And so there's lots of challenges. And I think that that's what a lot of times happens with trends. We tend to see these trends and we think, oh, is this a good trend or is this a bad trend? And we like to categorize them. And most trends are not binary that way. They are descriptions of what's happening in the world. And they could go in a negative direction and they could go in a positive direction. And a lot of times they'll be going in both directions at the same time.
Yes.
But that's why it's an interesting trend to watch, because as soon as you identify that, now you can start thinking about like, okay, how does that affect my business? How does that affect my life? What do I need to be thinking about? Right. And that's kind of the goal, I believe, of trends. They help us get smarter about the future so we can make the right calls for our professional lives and for our personal lives.
Who or what ultimately will shape the trend in terms of how it will play out, especially when they're accelerating in both directions?
It's always the choices that we make as people. And it's tempting to say, well, if this company takes off, then that trend is going to take off. So it's tempting to put the institutions at the center of that and say like, okay, if the government does this legislation, then that trend will take off. But it's never about that. It's always about like, who are the people who are working on this, who are choosing to propel it forwards? What are the choices we make as consumers in terms of where we spend our money and who we're giving our money to? What are the choices we make in terms of who we vote in, who then eventually enacts the legislation that allows this stuff to either happen or not happen? Like, those are the micro moments where these choices are all made that then eventually get made on an organizational or systemic level. And so I don't ever say, well, that's just a choice being made at this pay grade, like way outside of anything I have the influence of, because it's never really that way if you examine the details of it.
Wow. So many of us, man, live like victims, and we walk around acting like we don't have a choice in terms of how these trends are going to play out. And it can feel very overwhelming, scary. It sometimes feels like this dystopian sort of world is unfurling right before our eyes, and we can't do anything about it. In particular, it's a great example you shared here, is protective security, because like, it's really scary when you think about how that could play out. It's very Orwellian, as well, very draconian. So ultimately, you're saying, though, that the power lies with the citizen, with the consumer, and those choices are important. So there's almost a form of like, would you call it, would you say it's like a level of just being a conscious, aware citizen? Or is it just about knowing the power that you have and being more conscious of the choice you make? Because I think I could do a way better job of that. Like, just based on what you just said to me, I'm like, yeah, why do I just accept these products the way they are? Maybe I should not, do this one, buy this one from this company.
Yeah, we do. I mean, look, part of it is consumption. I mean, behaviors follow the money. And so the natural thing to think is, okay, well, am I buying the skincare cream that was tested on animals or not? I mean, that's a very straightforward, logical choice. And by the way, there's tools you can scan barcodes and figure out if something was ethically made. Am I buying the blood diamond, or am I buying the lab grown diamond? So these are like super simple, straightforward choices that people already get. The harder place to think about it is, for example, am I investing in a mutual fund that holds a portion of it in a company whose ethics I don't believe in, right? That becomes a lot harder to track, because like, you just invest in the mutual fund, and the mutual fund has hundreds of investments underneath it, including ones that you don't ethically believe in. So could you figure out a way of isolating that one? Probably not in that mutual fund, but could you invest in a ethical fund instead? Yes. Now, would the returns of that be as good as the returns on some of the other ones? That's a challenge, right? So like, it gets really complicated to put this into practice for ourselves, even though philosophically we think about it. And so eventually the human thing to do is to just look at all this stuff, try really hard, do a little research, and then just be like, this is too hard. This is too much work. It's just too difficult. And so we give up, right? And we move on.
It does come down to that. And it starts to feel like, but very, very powerless, like these things are going to happen regardless of our position in them. So we assume that it's the people in power. It's actually a funny, just even topic in general, because it really does come down to this idea of individualism versus a sort of collectivist angle on the whole thing. But just more specifically, it comes down to, well, if the powers that be at that company or that institution are moral and ethical, then I'm going to support them. But that's also sort of giving up your thinking process after a while, because it's like, they could shift. they could get jaded. I mean, did you see Social Dilemma? That documentary?
Yeah.
It's a beautiful example of something that's like completely taken over our lives, that I think, Facebook and all of these platforms were created with good intentions. I really do. I think that they were created by kids. It's like, that's a kid. It's a college student, Mark Zuckerberg. Like, he's just like, what can I do that's cool and fun, utilizing my skill set that could eventually be worth a lot of money, so that I can be an entrepreneur. And maybe even didn't go that far. Maybe like literally didn't even go that far. Like, I'm going to create something that works here at my university just to connect everybody, test it out. But these things evolve. And eventually you get to the point where now you've got a Mark Zuckerberg who only repeats lines that his lawyer gives him and completely robotic. And who knows what they're up to. And nobody seems to trust Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg and Facebook and now obviously Instagram because they're a part of it anymore. And so we're questioning social media. You got these trends like delete Instagram, going on and getting off social media. I think it was who was it recently that was like Naval Ravikant, I think, came out and said like this generation will be remembered as the one that deleted Instagram. And that's putting power over a trend. The trend probably being the dominance of social media in our lives, and it's how ubiquitous it is, and it's just completely everywhere all the time, and our digital self has become more important than our physical self or our identity, right? And so it's like, no, I'm going to take power over this, and I'm going to exercise it and use it the way that I like. And these are the things that are really important, man. I think you're talking about some really fascinating, important stuff that not enough people are talking about.
No, I mean, I think that it's finding. I mean, if we could apply to our digital lives the same thing that we apply to our real lives more effectively. So probably most people listening don't go out and have 4 donuts for breakfast, another 3 for lunch, and then ice cream, an ice cream sundae for dinner. Because we know that that's not a good way to live. Now, probably you wouldn't even feel good after that day, right? Even though it sounds like if you haven't had those things in a while, you're like, man, that sounds awesome, right? Or if you're a kid. But we know that we shouldn't do that. We know that we shouldn't spend all day streaming a show for 18 hours straight, 7 days in a row to get through like every year of 24, for example. We know we shouldn't do that, and we usually won't. But when it comes to digital choices, like being on Facebook, being on Instagram, how we use social media, we're doing exactly that. Right. So the addictive behavior that we don't practice in any other part of our life, we don't see as unusual when it comes to social media. We check the phone right when we wake up. We stay on it all the time. We don't put it down when we're standing in line at a grocery store. We don't stand in line anywhere without our phone because we got to constantly be checking. We're constantly scrolling. We're never finished. Right.
It makes me feel sick.
Yeah. I mean, and for a lot of people it does. Right. And so I think that there is this awakening and look, there's hope in this, right? And I'll tell you why. Because the generation that's growing up right now, my kids' generation, has so much knowledge and information about what's good and what isn't about social media. They get, when they watch the Disney Channel, there are ads, PSAs in between shows talking about how you shouldn't post anything online that you don't want to stay there forever because you can't take anything offline. You shouldn't be a cyberbully. You should respect people online. You should be kind to one another. You shouldn't have too much screen time. There's all this messaging and communication for the kids as they're growing up now about that. But the kids who are, I call them kids, but they're adults. I mean, in their 20s right now, right? Yeah. If you're in your 20s right now, you grew up with social media, but none of that training. Nobody ever told you about cyberbullying. Nobody ever told you because your parents didn't know. And there weren't ads on Disney about it. So you didn't know that something you could post when you were 14 is now going to come back 7 years later and get you canceled from somewhere. Nobody ever told you any of that stuff because we didn't know. Right. And so that's the generation that is now an adult and, in the workplace and dealing with all this stuff. That's the generation that's really struggling because they didn't grow up with any knowledge or training at all. So the hope is that the kids who are growing up with this right now, they have much more perspective on all of these things. And so my 16-year-old put his own screen time limiter app on his own phone. I didn't tell him to. He put it there by himself because he knows that he doesn't want to spend too much time sitting there glued to his screen. And he knows that he can't decide for himself. So now the app tells him how much time to spend.
Yeah. Wow. I had no idea. I did not know that there was this level of awareness with the younger generation these days. I assumed they were all in, just gone.
No, it's the 20-somethings that are in that
they're
situation
gone.
Because and it's not their fault really. I mean, they grew up with it without any real kind of boundaries being set or any sort of knowledge of what that was doing. So now they'd have to unlearn that, right? Sort of like growing up eating really unhealthily, and now all of a sudden it's like, oh, by the way, all that stuff that you were eating before, like that's killing you, so you need to totally change your eating habits.
So
It's hard to do.
there is a little bit of empathy that we should have when we see somebody doing a TikTok video in the airport. That's what you're like.
Hey, look, I have all there. I don't know what else you would do in an airport besides be on
Yeah.
social media. I mean, you're
Yeah.
just sitting there with delays
I
and doing
know.
nothing. And there's, I mean, other than eating really bad food, like, look, that's better than that at least. Like, at least you're.
Yeah. Yeah. But no, I really like and appreciate this perspective. It's really interesting, especially the one about, you know, I would say I guess it's like what's the one that comes after Z? Um, what X?
Yeah,
What's the
no,
one?
X
Yeah.
is before, and
Oh,
then
okay.
Gen
Yeah. Sorry.
Z is, I think Gen
What am
Y
I?
is the same as millennials,
Yeah.
and then
Oh,
Gen
Gen
Z
Z.
is the one
Yeah.
that comes
Yeah.
after. Yeah.
So yeah, I'm a millennial, but you know this next generation, Gen Z, you know, there is a lot of judgment always from the previous generation, always, no matter
Oh
what.
yeah,
It's
totally.
just like you lazies, you don't know what you're doing, you have no self awareness, and if you look at all the previous generations, your previous generation, it was like you're working your ass off, but you know the level of your parents and above is just like we worked our jobs for 40 years, what are you doing jumping around so much? And you know it just constantly there's an improvement and an evolution that happens with each generation, and that's a great thing.
Yeah.
Ultimately, that's a great thing. Speaking of, you know, kind of these younger generations, are you still teaching at Georgetown?
Currently, this semester, no.
And
But uh, most of the time, when I mean, I love teaching.
this is
Um,
you taught a marketing class,
I
right?
taught a global marketing class a
Wow.
couple years ago for several semesters, which was awesome because the whole class would go to London for a week. That was part of the class, so it was a traveling
Wow.
class, which was very cool. And then I took a semester off, and then I started teaching public speaking and persuasion,
Wow.
which was totally different, but I loved it because I didn't have any papers to grade.
Yeah.
um, and I could really hone in on like what makes somebody persuasive when they're speaking to you,
Yeah.
and that was fascinating for a different reason. But yeah, I learned so much from.
Yeah, what did you learn? You know, I've often like romanticized about the idea of teaching and lecturing and going back to university and sort of putting some time in there. What did you learn from this whole process?
Well, the first thing is it forces you to dissect what you already do in a way that you've never really had to, because when, for example, I started teaching public speaking, now I have to dissect everything that I'm doing already from a breathing point of view or from a preparation point of view, or like how I storyboard out something that's going to be compelling and how I find stories. And like, I don't really think about how I do those things. I just do them
Mm,
now. And now when I've got to go back, and this, by the way, this, I mean, this is specific to a course where you're creating the entire curriculum, right? So it wasn't like I
hmm.
became a professor, but they already had the curriculum and stuff, and I was just
Okay.
teaching it, right? So this is
Yes.
like my original elective course.
Yes.
So I imagine it would be different if I already had the curriculum and everything. I would probably just have to internalize it and then teach it.
Show up, do the job.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And not that it's easy, but it's a
Yeah.
different sort of teaching. Whereas
Mm,
this was me creating a course from nothing and figuring out, okay, how am I going to structure this whole thing, and then how are they going to uh, learn from that. And then specifically when it comes to speaking, like how am I going to give them feedback that simultaneously makes them better without feeling like they're not good at it,
mm,
which is a really hard thing to do when you give feedback to someone on their speaking,
hmm.
because there are clear things that they, like, maybe they talk too fast, maybe they're obviously nervous, maybe they don't speak loud enough. I mean, these are all things that are obvious to everybody who's listening, but when you relay them as feedback, it feels like you're being critical of them.
Yes.
And so the challenge every week I would have is, how do I deliver this feedback with kindness, with
Wow.
positivity, but also with like some level of criticism so that they can get better? Because I can't just tell them, hey, that was great, and then
Yeah.
expect them to improve, right? I have to actually teach them how to get better.
You have to be
And
honest.
that was a really interesting challenge. It wasn't easy.
Hmm. That's very difficult. That's the same thing as experienced in company leadership. I'm sure you've felt the same way, just even talking to an employee. Maybe it's challenging how you deliver feedback in a way that inspires action and awareness and improvement versus just like going home and feeling like shit, because that it's tricky. You can really mess somebody up.
Yeah, I mean, I'm
It's
thinking
very
about that
true.
constantly because, like, I mean, I own a publishing company too, right? And
Right.
a lot of times we'll have authors coming to us with ideas. Some of the ideas are good, some of them are not so good, but like we can only take maybe a tenth of what we get. And
Hmm.
so this challenge every week that I have is how to reject somebody with kindness, and not because, especially when you think about a book, like for somebody to get to the point where they've got a book proposal and they put it in front of you, like that could have been their life's work, right? They might have spent the last
Yes.
20 years working on what they're working on to get to something that you just looked at very briefly. And so
Hmm.
to give them feedback that's destructive for them is essentially, even though you don't realize it, you might be destroying 20 years worth of what they've been working on. And I don't want to
Big
be that
time.
guy. Like, I don't want to be that person, right? So I always think, like, I always assume that. I mean, maybe somebody just worked on a book proposal for 3 weeks and put it in front of me and that was it, right? But I
Yeah.
always assume that they invested their time and heart and soul into this thing that eventually made it in front of me. And so even if it's not I can't say yes to everybody. So even if it's not a great fit for me or for us, I have to be willing to take the time to respect them enough to turn them down, but to do it in a way that doesn't destroy what they've been working on.
Good on you. Good on you, Rohit. I've been destroyed multiple times. So, and the worst type is when it's a work that I would consider an art, like a book. That's painful. It is so painful for someone to just give a very quick sort of rejection. That's why we often hear the stories of the great authors, rejection stories, right, from various publishers and things like that. And while it's interesting, it's like you obviously have to be so selective. At Ideapress is the company you're talking about, by the way. You have to be so selective, but at the same time, so so honest and give them the time of day. This company, is it correct to say it was rooted in your experience with traditional publishing and wanting to provide a better model?
Yeah, that's exactly what the entrepreneur's story was. Exactly that. It was me being
Hmm.
frustrated with what alternatives I had as an author and vowing to myself that I wasn't going to put myself through that for another book. I'd done that twice. So I had two,
Hmm.
large publishers, big book deals with advances. And after I did that second one, I just realized that that wasn't going to work for me anymore.
Yeah. But
And that
speaking of
was,
trends,
yeah.
where do you think books are going? Do you think they're
Book,
here to stay and grow and expand, and they're still worth it?
yes, on every level. And I realize that I'm probably biased, being that I'm in the industry.
Sure.
But at the same time, I mean, I think what a book gives to people, both the author and the person who picks it up, is something that you really can't replicate in any other media channel.
Totally
Having an
agree.
ebook doesn't deliver that. Having a YouTube video doesn't deliver that. Having a white paper that somebody downloads doesn't deliver the same thing. And so think that this idea of books, and we've seen a revisiting of that, especially during the pandemic. I mean, if you know anything about the book publishing industry, you know that last year was one of the most successful years in the last decade for printed books. Now, to some degree, that was because of huge sellers like the Obama book that kind of prop up the entire industry. But you regularly have books like that. I mean, you have the Harry Potter book that sort of accounted for X% of all book sales across the world for that one year, whenever it came out, right? Times
Hmm.
multiple Harry Potter books. So you always do have those big mega selling books, but there is a longevity and a feeling to a book that is dramatically different.
I think it might have been Carl Sagan. I don't remember exactly, but he talked about this idea that within a book, you are essentially creating an experience that you can't replicate anywhere else. You have this author, dead or alive. You could be picking up a book from the ancient past, and what you essentially get is the ideas of that person. As you said, it could be that they've been working on it for 20 years. In most cases, in the nonfiction world, right, in the business and psychology world, things like that, it's like 3 to 5 years of that person's life. And it's the best that they can possibly come up with, because writing is not a first draft. Writing is rewriting. That's the best, kind of way
Yeah.
to think about writing, right? It's like the constant revision of writing is eventually what creates the writing in a book, which means that these ideas have been fleshed out over and over and over again by the author themselves, by an editor, by the friends that they, put the manuscript in their hands, in order to create a stellar, incredible, masterful book. And then you get a reader, and that reader, at least this is the experience I've had. When I read a great book, actually, when I read any book, I feel like I'm having a one on one dinner conversation with that author. It feels so personal. And it's up to me as the reader to determine how long I want that conversation to last. I can put the book down. I can pick the book up. And you can't create that same experience, as you said, with video, with podcasting. In comparison, podcasting. Again, I think podcasting is an incredible medium to share knowledge and stories and information. I fundamentally believe that. I think it's incredible. But it's completely different. A conversation is raw, unedited, which is exciting, but that process of editing and refining and rewriting and the experience that you create with a book, I don't think that you can create anywhere else. And for that reason, I agree with you that this medium of books, I don't think is going anywhere. I do worry sometimes about the number of people reading books. And I know there's a great, is there a trend toward more audio? Like, are we seeing more
Yeah,
audio?
I mean, there is definitely audiobooks have been, I mean, the numbers show audiobooks have been growing year after year. And I think it makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
People are doing a lot of things and they can be listening to something at the same time and they can't be watching, which I think is part of the reason why podcasts are so popular also, because it enables us to do multiple things. And there are many, many moments in our lives, many people who have the sorts of jobs where they can be listening to something while they're doing that job.
Yes.
And it doesn't really affect what they're doing.
Mm.
And so part of it is that, and I think we forget, those of us who sit on our computers all day and kind of do this sort of writing stuff and those types of things, where if I was listening to a podcast, like that would distract me from doing my work.
Oh, big
Whereas
time
there
for
are
me too.
people who, the podcast is happening while they're working and it doesn't affect their work. So remembering that, I think, is one piece of it, but also just the longevity of a book. I mean, I have books on my bookshelf that my grandfather wrote. And
Hmm. Wow.
if there were podcasts around when he was, doing his writing and stuff 75 years ago, I would probably have them sitting on my computer somewhere, like on a hard drive. But would I ever listen to them or look at them? Probably not, because it's digital. And
Hmm.
so, yeah, that stuff didn't exist. And so the only outlet that he had to do what he was doing was the writing of the books. But just think 75 years from now, like how much digital stuff are my grandkids going to have that's sitting on a drive somewhere, but that nobody ever looks at, versus the, 7 or however many books I eventually have by the time I stop writing books, like those will sit on a shelf somewhere and somebody might actually open one of them.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's a beautiful thing too. It's a fun thing to collect books. I just recently have had to move like so many times over the years, and one of the saddest things that ever happened to me is like giving my books. I give books away all the time when I want to give them. You know what I mean? It's different from the time I had to just give them all away and start over.
Yeah.
And I went through this period where I thought that's okay. I have it on Kindle. No, I was miserable. I literally felt like I was missing a part of my life. So I've had to like buy a shit ton of books again to just get that feeling back. And I
Yeah.
keep them in different parts of the house. Like it's just a nice feeling.
Well, remind me, I'll put
Yeah.
you on our readers panel, because at the end of every year, we do the non-obvious book awards, and I get sent between 300 and 400 different non-obvious, hopefully winning non-obvious nonfiction books,
Oh.
and we evaluate them. And then at the end of it, I just have this big kind of moment where everybody who's on our team, like people who are in different groups who've done work for us, like they pick with the books that they want, and I just send them back out again. And I
That's
donate some
awesome.
to a library, and I send some to all these different places, and I give some to the teachers at my kids' school, and like we get them out, back out again for
Wow.
another kind of round of being with people who would read them.
Wow. Good for you. What, as we kind of work toward wrapping up, I'm curious with the way you're spending your time and all the things that you have going on, what's really the thing that you're most excited about right now? Where are you really focused in terms of not necessarily, that trend or anything like that, but just anywhere in terms of your work and everything you got going on?
I think there's a couple projects. So I've got two books that are in development right now that are quite
Hmm.
different from any other books that I've done previously. One is called Beyond Diversity, and it's
Hmm.
a deep exploration about 12 themes around diversity that was inspired by a pretty ambitious virtual summit that we did a couple months ago. And I've
Hmm.
got a co-author named Jennifer Brown, who's a diversity and inclusion expert, writing that with me. And so that's going to be out in late 2021. And then I've got another book, which is all about trends and imagining a safer, fairer, and better future called The Future Normal, which I'm co-authoring with a futurist named Henry Coutinho Mason, who's a British guy and colleague of mine and good friend.
Hmm.
And that's coming out in 2022.
Wow.
So those two books are some things I'm really excited about and have been
You're a
working
book
on.
machine.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and they're very different, right? I mean, one is a deep
Yes.
dive on diversity, one is really about future and trends and the sort of thing that I've written about in the past. And people who know my work know the non-obvious trend book. I wrote an annual edition of that every year for 10 years. And
Hmm.
last year, non-obvious megatrends was the final edition of that. So I stopped that. So that was
Right.
like me, on this 10-year project. And then just walked away from it and said, I'm I've done what I wanted to do with it. Now I'm moving on to other things. And so that was a big moment for me too, because I moved from
Yeah.
this project to kind of other things. So the books are big for me. And then, as you
Hmm.
know, the publishing company is we've got these amazing books coming up. We just continually get fascinating topics, and I just love working with all these authors. And so, like, I'm just super excited about all of those. I mean, it's so
Wow.
much
It's a lot
fun
to
every
manage.
almost every month to have like a new book that you worked on kind of coming out, and you
Yeah.
can celebrate that,
Yeah.
hold it in your hands, and all the stuff that goes along with having a book.
Right. Well, I'm curious, when do you do your writing? What's your process? What time of day and what's your goal
Morning,
when you sit
always
down?
morning.
Hmm.
Morning or late night is
Mm.
when I'm most productive with writing. So probably after when we have school, it's after I drop my son off at school. So it's like I start at 8 a.m. and I go until about 1 o'clock. And then I
Mm.
don't try to do any writing until if I'm on a deadline, then I'll go back to it probably after 9 o'clock p.m. And then I
Hmm.
could go from like 9 to 2. So if I'm like full on with writing, like those are my writing times. It's 8 to 1 and then 9 p.m. to 2 a.m.
Wow. That's very unique. Wow. You just have to, right? It's like those are the pockets of time that are most quiet. And I find those are the times that creativity seems to rise to the surface as well.
Yeah, it's not even the quiet thing. I mean, I have apps that simulate the sound of a coffee shop, and so like the
Hmm.
quiet thing is not really a big motivator for me. It's not like, oh, everybody's
Ah.
finally at bed, so now I can write. It's not really that. For
Mm.
me, it's more like, I want to be able to spend time with the family. I want to be able to go to like soccer practice or go and work out with my son, or like, and all that stuff happens between like 1 and 9 in the afternoon, right?
Yeah.
And so I save that time to just kind of live life and do all that stuff. And then if I'm on deadline, then I'll work again in the late evening because I got to finish stuff.
Hmm. Hmm. Wow.
But yeah,
Beautiful. Beautiful, man. So, how can the audience, my listeners, the people watching support? What's the best way to kind of like get in touch and support you and your work? And do you have if you have a specific ask or an action you'd love to see, just let us know.
yeah, thank you. So everything we are working on aligning the brand stuff right now because I have too many different places where everything exists. But nonobvious.com should be the
Okay.
home base for pretty much everything. And from there, you can get details about the trend book that we kind of talked about, non-obvious megatrends. We didn't really talk about it, but I also have two guidebooks that I wrote under the
Hmm.
non-obvious brand. We have this whole
Mm-hmm.
guidebook series that sort of competes with the dummies guides. and I wrote one on working remotely. So the non-obvious guide to working remotely without getting distracted, lonely, or bored. And then I wrote another one called The Non-Obvious Guide to Marketing and Branding, which is really like a 101 on everything you would ever want to know about marketing. And we're actually talking to a bunch of college professors about making it the textbook for marketing 101 classes. So those two are out. And then, like I said, the other two new books, which you can sign up to be an early reader of, and then you can see the book before anybody else and join our launch team and all that stuff. That'll all be on from Non-Obvious. You can go to either nonobviousdiversity.com or just from Non-Obvious to get the Beyond Diversity book. And then Future Normal is just at futurenormalbook.com.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Rohit, I want to acknowledge you, man. You have my full support, first of all, with all of your projects, everything that you're doing. I absolutely love it. And I have to say, now that we've gotten some time to get to know each other and chat, and, you have a lot of integrity. You have a lot of integrity. You're a very easygoing, laid back person for how much success you have. You're very humble. You really are. And you play the humble card really well. You've done some incredible things. And I hope you feel that. I hope you're proud of yourself. And I feel honored to know you. Thanks for spending time with me, man. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for inviting me. I loved your questions and the conversation. I mean, I already knew from having listened before it was going to be a good conversation. So I was all ready to go.
Awesome.
And you delivered. So thank you.
Thank you, man. That's a wrap.